I'm only recently an American citizen. I was born in Ireland, and soon after I was born, my family returned. They'd been living for years in Libya. So I was the last child, and I was brought to Libya. I lived in Libya for about 7 years. And then we were evacuated. There was some hostilities. Some things never change. I spent about 6 months going to maybe 5 or 6 different schools in London and Ireland. And then we were offered a new position. And the company said to my parents, you can live in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, or Kuala Lumpur. And of course, they said, we're not going back anywhere hot. So no to Jeddah. And we went to KL. So I was in ISKL from 1984 to 1991, which does sound forever ago. I apologize. I'm old now. And I guess have been for a while. But that was 4th grade through graduation. And then, yeah, that's right. What I did then was I went to Duke. I had never lived in America, not American. Knew plenty of Americans from ISKL, but I'd only visited America maybe twice before I came and moved here. And yeah, it was a novel experience, that's for sure. And I did plenty of things wrong. I was prevented from seeing places I was interested in going to because it was forever away, and people didn't really do that very much back then. I did get lucky though, because I happened to have been in the environs of Duke before I matriculated, because I was doing a soccer camp at UNC down the road. I didn't realize that there was great hostilities between the places, but nevertheless, I at least stepped foot on Duke's campus before I showed up with my suitcases. But I still had no idea what I was doing. Spent 4 years at Duke, and then I worked for a law firm for a year. And then I went to Harvard for law school. I'm one of the few people, I think, who maybe preferred my graduate school to undergrad. Harvard Law School was good. I enjoyed it a lot. Not everybody does. Most people really prefer their colleges. But like I said, for me, it was a close call. And maybe even Ty went to Harvard. Then I worked for a judge for a year, which is not uncommon for people who graduate from law school. And then I worked for a startup for 6 months, which is uncommon for anybody who's gone to a law school. And then the world imploded, the economy crashed. And so I was out of that job. But the good news was, when you have a JD, a law degree, it's not terribly hard to go back to a law firm. So I did. I worked at a law firm for about 4 or 5 years. And then I got a job as a law professor. And I've been in Chicago as a law professor for about 15 years now. And I guess the end of this story is that not that long ago, I was in your situation, because I was applying to college, not really to college. I was applying to history graduate school. And I got in. And Hina, this is for you. I'm about 2 years into a 7-year PhD program. But one of the things the happy things that happens as you pass along that path is, after about 2 years, that's what's coming your way, Hina. This is a master's degree from Chicago. I got mine last week. It doesn't really count. The PhD is still 5 years away. So I've been applying and attending and teaching at and living at law schools and colleges and universities for basically most of my time in America. And I just realized, as I was thinking about this, as a college kid, I spent 3 years on a first-year dorm, which is really unusual. Really unusual. And it suggests like I failed and was held back 3 years. No, that's not what happened. I attended once because I was a first year. And then I did something else as a sophomore. And then as a junior and a senior, I was an RA. So I lived again on a first year dorm. So I have seen a lot of first year students come into college and make all sorts of mistakes, and have successes, of course, but many of the mistakes are remarkably common. So I'm happy to talk about those if you like. So that's me. That's my connection to sort of tertiary education in the United States. And now it's your turn. So I should warn you before we get into things too much, when you teach at law school, most law schools, and particularly those in Chicago, adhere to the Socratic method, which means after an awkward silence, I'll start calling on people because I see your names here before me in the participant list. But there's no need to get hostile. There's no need to do that. What questions do all of you have? Do any of you have? I think I heard that other than Hina, most of you are not seniors about to matriculate. I think most of you are before that and thinking about applications. Okay, Ashley. If you don't have a question, tell me, are you thinking about coming to school in the United States?
Yeah.
Do you have a pretty good idea of the kinds of places you'd like to go or the places you'd like to apply?
Yeah.
Are you a junior?
Yeah.
Well, then you've got a lot of it figured out. I suppose the only thing left to do is to actually apply. Well, you didn't ask this, Ashley, but I'm going to assume this is a question for you. What can you do about your applications at this point? And the answer, of course, is, and I hope this is good news. Maybe it's bad news, but I think it's good news. Not a ton, not a ton, because the fact is you've sort of taken the classes you've taken and you've gotten the grades in those that you've gotten, and you're going to take standardized tests and you'll get the scores you can get, you're going to get in those. I do think it's a lot more common these days than it certainly was in my time for people to study for those tests. And for that, I offer you my condolences. In my day, you just had to sort of show up and fill in the circles, and that was good enough. But these days, there's, of course, more pressure on studying for it. I can't help you with that. What I can talk a little bit about is the essay, or the essays. And I'll tell you something that I hope is good news right now, which is the only reason I got into Duke was because of my essay. And, I mean, that's, who cares about me? Let's talk about you. And all of you are capable, by virtue of the fact that you're living in a place like ISKL, of writing essays that are going to be so much more interesting and compelling than most of the people who are similarly situated in the United States. That's just a fact. I mean, I remember as a first year, people talking about how unusual the neighborhoods they came from in the United States were because they were on like the other side of the railroad tracks in Philadelphia. And that's just not Kuala Lumpur. That's just not Southeast Asia, 12,000 miles away. It's just nowhere near as interesting. So I guess my main piece of advice on the essays is you really should write about the kind of experiences of your daily life in a place like KL. I mean, I shouldn't tell you what you should do. I'll tell you what worked for me and that I think is sort of a compelling essay that would stand out from a pile of stuff about growing up in America. Growing up in KL, it's just way more interesting. And one thing I didn't fully appreciate when I was growing up in KL is that it just happens to be located at the confluence of the busiest shipping lanes in the world between the two largest civilizations on the planet, which means it's an incredibly, incredibly unusual spot that really is at sort of the center of the geopolitical center of the world, which is why it has really, really great food. You don't have to write about geopolitics. I didn't. I wrote about the fact that some days I would have like Indian food for breakfast and Malay food for lunch and Chinese dishes for dinner. And I know that turned out to be a big deal for me because some of my American classmates had a very nasty habit of talking about their scores and GPAs when I was a first year, which is, that's not a good practice. That's going to leave somebody unhappy. And it left me unhappy for most of the time. Until I realized that, of course, as is the saying in real estate, you always want the cheapest house on the block. I kind of liked having the worst scores on the block because it meant that I was at a better school than I should have gotten into. And it also meant that I had written a pretty good essay. And I know that because the hiring dean said, the admissions dean said that to me later on, that's why she had let me in. I think that's good news for all of you, as I say, because it's within your control. It hasn't actually occurred yet. You can still write the essay. And it can really be very personal about your daily life in a place that's as unusual as it is. I suspect some of you, if you've been there for a while, it may not feel that unusual. If you've lived in other places like it, it may not feel that unusual. But it really is. It really is. And I think an essay that simply describes all of the radically different kinds of cultures and as I said, even things like foods, that automatically make your essay a lot more interesting. There's just nothing, there's no place in this continent, in the United States, that's as compelling. New Orleans and Montreal are pretty good, but nothing's like KL. Ethan, what's your question?
You said you worked as a lawyer in investment management before. Could you elaborate more on that?
I didn't say that, but you read that somewhere, so congratulations. You did the homework. Yeah, investment management is a collective phrase for two kinds of ways that people tend to invest. For the great unwashed, people like me, the way you invest is that a little bit of your salary is taken out and put into funds, typically mutual funds and retirement accounts. Those are called public investment funds, mutual funds, ETFs, pension funds. That's one half of investment management. And the other half is the sort of crazy, exciting stuff that's going to kill us all, which is hedge funds, private equity, venture capital. And so I practiced mainly on the public funds, the first ones, and I teach primarily on the second ones. So I do all of that. And yeah, it's interesting. It's going to take you a while to get there if you're interested, Ethering. You're first going to need the bachelor's degree, and then you might need a law degree, but not necessarily. A law degree if you want to be the lawyer doing it, but most of the people who do that in earnest, like actually work in those kinds of areas, aren't doing it as lawyers. So people who are working in connection with venture capital are usually people starting up companies. Most of the people who do hedge fund stuff in earnest are not lawyers either. They're usually like disenchanted astrophysicists, people who are really good with pulling order out of huge, immense pools of data that look chaotic, but that actually seem to have some signal in there, and translating that into the markets, the financial markets, and figuring out ways to make money. Like determining correlations between the fact that markets tend to sort of perk up on days where the weather is, 2 standard deviations better than normal. That's the kind of thing a hedge fund trader would determine and then trade upon. And then private equity is generally buying entire companies, taking them private, trying to fix them up a little bit. This is like HGTV, like house flipping, and then selling it a few years down the line. So to translate that a little bit, Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg, Mark Zuckerberg, they're the venture capitalists. Mitt Romney is the private equity person. And people you haven't heard of, but that make huge amounts of money, are the hedge fund people. So in my town, it's a person by the name of Ken Griffin, who runs Citadel. But more broadly, it's people like Stephen Cohen. And the one name you probably have heard of is George Soros. So those are hedge fund people. It's interesting. And there's obviously a lot of money at stake, but you can't study it in college. All you can do in college is, and this is, I guess, a broader lesson, and a lesson I ignored for a long time, is really do the best you can in all the classes you have. That sounds sort of banal and obvious, but it's not. Most colleges require a certain amount of breadth and a certain amount of depth, and you'll feel aggrieved at some of the classes you have to take to match those requirements. And I promise you that there's something to be gotten out of all of those classes. And I'm not just saying that because I finished a book yesterday called Range that was attempting to sort of counteract the Malcolm Gladwell thesis that you need to do something incredibly boring and specific for 10,000 hours. This was more like the people making the most interesting breakthroughs actually know a lot about a lot of different things. So if that's where you're headed, Ethering, I suggest, I do suggest college first. I mean, I know that Bill Gates and Zuckerberg sort of only dabbled in college, but I think for most people, college is a solid start. You thinking about doing that kind of thing? As a lawyer or as a financier or as an entrepreneur?
Finance.
Say again, finance?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, actually, Malaysia happens to have something now that it never had when I was there, which is a really, really wealthy sovereign wealth fund. Now, that's good news and bad news. It's good news because it means that if you're so inclined, you could probably get up close to that and see what they do. Sovereign wealth funds are like really large hedge funds. The bad news is if you talk about it too publicly, people will get embarrassed because Malaysia Sovereign Wealth Fund was the victim of Joe Low's like $8 billion embezzlement. So the next best thing to do is read $1 Billion Whale, if you haven't already, which is just an unbelievably entertaining story of terrible graft and horrible, late stage capitalism, but also some local color. I think there are scenes in the Petronas Towers. Any questions about attending or trying to get into colleges of your choice? Ether?
I have a question.
Oh yeah, you got one, Kyle? Yeah, go ahead. What do you got, Kyle?
It's a bit down the road, but how does college admissions differ from undergraduate and graduate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tend to think that undergraduate admissions are more humane and probably better tilted towards people in your circumstances. Because as I said earlier, and as I believe, college applications give you an opportunity to sort of make the claim that you're actually an interesting individual. And more importantly, that being an interesting individual is something that that school might want. Graduate schools, at least with respect to law schools, tend to be less humane. So first of all, the size of the class plummets. So not everywhere. The class at Harvard is relatively big. It's like 500 people. The class at the University of Chicago is like 200 people. So many good colleges have classes as large as 1,500 people or 2,000 people. So if you've cut that to 10% of that, your odds get a lot harder. But also something I've noticed, and this is unfortunate, and I'm not sure what to do about it. The good news is none of you have to worry about this yet. You've got 4 years at least to figure it out yourself. I've tend to notice that some of the better law schools really, really care greatly about the metrics that go into the students they admit, which is a shame, because what it means is there's not a lot you can do to sort of express your individuality and win acceptance for the wonderfulness that's you. And it's more about things like LSAT scores and GPAs. So much so that there's been this kind of development, which I find peculiar. So when I was at law school, again, granted, it was a relatively large law school class, but I think in my law school class, there was something on the order of 50 people in that class from one college. It happened to be Harvard, of course, because it's part of the pipeline. But like Yale had like 25 people. And these days, when I look around at law school classes coming into a place like the University of Chicago, you don't see that. And you might ask, why not? And the reason is because what you see instead is like the valedictorian from colleges you haven't heard of, or colleges you don't know much about. And what the law school attempts to be doing is to be making its numbers look as good as possible by getting the person with the highest GPA from 200 different schools. My sense is that their perfect model of acceptance would be to have the valedictorian of the top 200 colleges in America. And that would be their ideal class. That is not an ideal class. There's a lot of reasons why that class is constrained. I personally think it would be a lot more interesting to not care about that as much and to find people who've done and do interesting things. And as I say, when I was in law school, it didn't look like that at all. There were many larger chunks. Now, some people will be like, well, that system's not fair either, because if you didn't happen to go to those great colleges, then your odds stink. To which I guess I would say, maybe, I don't know. I don't think so. I think that system was maybe a little less hypersensitive to like US news scores. But like I said, I don't think that happens anywhere near to the same degree with respect to applying to undergraduate admissions. And I guess this is the theme of my talk now. I think essays do a lot more at the undergraduate level than they do at the graduate level. I'm not going to talk too much about the history program application because that's even weirder. There are 16 people in my cohort, 16. That means the people who were admitted to the history department, there was 15 others. So I don't know what to tell you at that point. At that point, it's just like you're approaching sort of crazy randomness. Yeah, I don't know. Be like 45 and have had a career behind you. Don't do that. I'm the only one who looks like that in my class. I think that's something to worry about at another day. As I say, I think the good news is you've all got very compelling stories to tell, and it matters the most, I think, at the undergraduate level. So, Kyle, you've got an Irish last name. Where are you from?
I'm half British, half Japanese.
Okay, very good. So, but you're not interested in going back to either of those places for college, or perhaps you are, or you're thinking about America as well?
Yeah, I'm thinking about America as well, but also England and Japan.
Yeah, okay, that's a nice set of options to have. To be honest, I never seriously considered Ireland because I'd never really lived in Ireland besides a few weeks between the two big countries. So I didn't know anybody, and I didn't know anything about the system. I think ISKL actually did a much better job preparing me for America than it did for Ireland. Although I think that's probably changed a lot in the last couple of decades because of programs like the IB. But for me, it was very American-centric, which is fine, because even though I came here insisting I would soon leave and that I was not going to enjoy it at all, 20 years later, I became a citizen. So it roped me in. it roped me in.
William,
Okay,
can you
so
talk a
yeah,
little
go ahead.
bit about, you know, if you can remember back to when you were maybe a junior and you were making these considerations, and then maybe even after you had applied and gotten into the variety of schools that accepted you, what was the most challenging thing about moving from Malaysia into your university setting?
Yeah. You mean making the decision about where to go, or like physically, like, you know, uprooting my life and going to a new country, or both?
Well, I think one of the things, and it might be jumping the gun a bit, because it's not about the application itself, but when people are juniors and they're making the decision of whether to even apply to some of the high level schools that you've gone to, it's helpful to hear about like what was easy or challenging about making that transition, because you said you hadn't been there, and you know, it's a huge culture change and that sort of thing. So I thought it would be interesting to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, first, just on the first part, apply everywhere. I mean, I understand that there are costs, and so it's not free, but I think I repeatedly got into places I shouldn't have gotten into. So do it. Don't let your failure to apply be the reason you didn't go to a school that, you know, was terrific or that you would have loved. I gather that the marginal cost is not too bad. So, you know, do it. Apply to those kinds of places. I would be very wary about limiting your own choices on that. So the challenge for me, the answer to your question is, the challenge for me is I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything. And even though it sounds relatively I mean, maybe it does. It sounds relatively cosmopolitan now to hear me say like, oh, I grew up in Libya and Malaysia. It wasn't to me, because I'd spent the sort of 8 sentient years of my life in KL, which is one place. It's a really cool, interesting place, but that at that time it was very far away from the United States. I know it's still in the same place, but I think all of you know a lot more about America than I ever did. There was no YouTube. But there was, you know, in fairness to what it was, as it probably still is today, the dominant culture. So I guess Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger told me everything I needed to know about moving to America, because that was my consumption of Americana through just US films. So, you know, this was a cliche I heard a bunch, and I'm sort of loath to repeat it because it sounded so stupid to me at the time, but it turned out to be sort of accurate. First thing that's different is the food is nowhere near as good. And it didn't bother me right away, because I was actually pretty keen to try things like meatball subs and Philly cheesesteaks and pizza, you know, a la Americain. So I ate a lot of that, and I thought that was fine. I didn't, but then, you know, a couple of years into really sort of pedestrian American food, you start to come back to sort of really good food, and the only place you get that is, you know, at least that I found it, was in Asian restaurants in America. And even though the world is a lot more interesting and cosmopolitan now, and it's smaller now, you know, Asian foods here, like many places, cater to the local audiences, typically with a relatively lowest common denominator. So trust me, like the 2 or 3 Malaysian restaurants I've been to in America don't look anything like the closest stalls. They're just not that good. They're catering to American tastes and honesty. So one thing I would definitely have done, had I thought about it in your position, before I left KL, I would take cooking lessons. I would. I mean, I'm pretty good at cooking, and but I still don't know how to cook any really good Malaysian dishes. And the one thing that's different now between then is you can actually probably get most of those ingredients in the United States now. Couldn't when I arrived, but now you can. So if you actually learn the techniques and the ingredients firsthand, you'll actually be able to replicate it here. Okay, that's probably not the that's probably not the question you were asking, but I will say I was struck by by a certain degree of parochialness in my classmates when I got to the United States. It's not their fault. This is where they grew up. But, you know, I mean, I was once asked if people in Malaysia or Ireland spoke American. You know, that was not a great question to get when I first arrived. The other thing I was asked when I soon arrived, now maybe you'll all be a lot more sensitive to this than I was because the times are different, but I remember being asked right out of the gate when I arrived at Duke by the woman who was the head of the International House, which is the place that's meant to cater to international students, although she was a person who had never left the state of North Carolina in her life. And she asked me what I thought of the racial problems in America, and specifically North Carolina. And of course, my answer was, I don't know anything about them. I just got here. And America, as you can probably tell, even from KL these days, is very concerned about its racial issues. And unfortunately, it's got them. It does. Now, I think some of the places that are most sort of insulated from that are places like college campuses that are remarkably diverse and aware of their diversity and celebratory of their diversity. So, which made the question also peculiar, because I was like, I haven't witnessed what you're talking about, and I'm not going to witness it on this campus really in any sort of serious way. But it really is, now maybe things in Malaysia have changed. Of course they have, it's been a long time. But my experience of Malaysia was that it had a, and certainly ISKL, was that diversity was very easy and not natural, but very smooth and unremarkable in a sort of beautiful way. And it's not really. So I remember people here being very fraught about it. And, you know, I mean, I guess that's all for the better. I guess it's sort of an intellectual struggle that people are attempting to come to terms with and to try to reconcile and to improve upon. Not always, not in all places. But, you know, that was certainly a big difference. You know, it felt a long way from home, that's for sure. And the other problem for me then was that I wasn't quite sure where home was. So I'm the youngest of 4 children, I think I mentioned. And so soon after I went to college, my parents left KL. They had stayed there basically so that I could graduate from ISKL. And then they took a new gig in Cairo, which was awesome. I mean, that's a pretty cool place to go for your winter and summer holidays during college. But it meant that I only ever went back to KL once. I went back at my first winter break, and I haven't been back in 30 years. And that's very sad. That's very sad. Because it's a beautiful place. I really, really enjoyed it. I didn't quite appreciate how much I enjoyed it until I left it, as is so trite and true of many things. But yeah, I mean, being in college can be a difficult transition for everybody. A lot of people are lonely in college. I think it's obviously harder if the source of your loneliness is, you know, measured in thousands of miles, in hemispheres, as opposed to, you know, a couple hundred miles. Now the good news about that, I think, is most American kids feel that way too. And like I said, I've been on a first-year dorm 3 times, and I've seen it again and again. And it's important when you encounter challenges in a place like this, to try to titrate the difference between what is your challenge and what is just a challenge. And I think it can be easy to tell yourself, like, this stinks. I shouldn't have. I never thought this, but some people might. I shouldn't have come here. It's so far away. It's so difficult for me. And that's uniquely so because I came from Malaysia. I think that's actually, I think a lot of American kids are feeling 80% of that, 90% of that. And so you'll actually have a lot more in common with some of those dynamics than you might expect. You might think I'm the only one really feeling this way because they're after all in the same country. But as I sort of alluded to earlier, a lot of Americans, I mean, I guess they appreciate, maybe that's the best word you could use, that their country is a really big place. And it is. I mean, it's colossally larger than Malaysia. And you know, it's a lot larger than Ireland too, which is where I'm from. And I spent time in Britain and Libya. It's bigger than all those places. And I mean, unless you're from Russia, maybe Australia, maybe Canada, there's not a lot of places that are as big as the United States. And what that means is many American kids really feel like they've gone to the far side of the moon. And I remember, I mean, I had to like stifle the laugh when people on my first year hall were like, you know, I'm from California. It's like, and I was like, that's the same country. What are you talking about? That doesn't count at all. But for them, it really felt like they had just, you know, left Earth's orbit. So I think that I didn't appreciate it the first time, but when I saw it again and again, I realized, you know, that's a challenge that a lot of children or a lot of first years are going to feel. Who's got a question before we go?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering if you have any advice on what we can do now to like help our admissions process, like down the line.
Yeah, you know, I'm aware. I hate to sort of reinforce the standardized testing industrial complex, but I gather that since, you know, people that you're going to be competing with are going to be preparing for it, that's probably something I guess I would be thinking about a little bit in your circumstances. But really, the thing that I would really urge is the essay, because, you know, with the exception of a few, you know, degrees or percentages of improvement on a standardized test or even your grades, those are relatively marginal changes to what your file is going to look like. But the essay can be radically different. It can look like something that no one in this country, which is the basis of most of the other people applying, can produce. And so what I would say is think a lot about that. Think a lot about that. And in fact, what I would say is write a lot. Try a bunch of different drafts. I mean, I didn't want to look at my stuff until it was, you know, like I really had to do it. But if I could have done it again, I think, yeah, trying those essays and giving them to people to read and seeing what people think of them. That to me seems like the area where you can distinguish yourself the most from all the other people that are going to be applying. And as I say, you happen to live in one of the most interesting places on the planet. So if you can sort of tell a story about yourself and about Malaysia and how those two things sort of interact and blend, I think your essay will just leap right out of your application file. And I will say one other thing. I spent a couple of years touring, being a tour guide at Duke when I was there. So I spent a lot of time in the admissions office, and I wouldn't have believed this. I would not have believed it unless I had seen it firsthand. But the dean of admissions oversees a staff of like 15 people, and she knew the details of every one of the 6,000 students at Duke, right? 1,500 a year times 4. So when I said to her as a junior and a senior, oh, you know, I'm an RA now, and in a first year dorm, and she said, oh, well, who are your kids? And I mentioned, you know, Ben von Klemper, and she's like, oh yeah, from Paramus, New Jersey, and like they read the files. Now, maybe you're not old enough to be jaded by it, but as somebody who's received a lot of paperwork in my time, I can tell you most files just don't get read. They just don't. But the fact is, the people who work in college admissions are trying, and they're very earnest, and they take very seriously the idea that they have this sort of limited set of slots to give to people in a very competitive world. And so they're reading it. And I suspect, and if my experience is any guide, the thing that they're most looking forward to reading is the essay, because the rest is just numbers. So the essay really is the time to sort of savor the application. And pretty quickly, and in fact, I think in 90% of the cases, they're not going to savor anything. They're just going to get sort of like warm water. But your essays are the chance, I think, to write something that they won't have seen or thought or heard of before. That's where I would focus my energy.
Thank
But
you
other
so
than that,
much,
just
William.
savor
I
Malaysia.
wanted to kind of leave with maybe one tip from Hina, since she's just finished this process, and she and I worked pretty closely together on her essays. I'm going to put you on the spot, and if you had to give these guys one piece of advice that you felt really helped you with those essays, what would it be?
I would just say I would lean into like any passions or interests you have. I focused on one thing specifically, and then I added this whole multicultural aspect that we have into my essay. So I didn't focus on, oh, I'm from different cultures, or I'm in this place where I have a multicultural background, because there's plenty of international students applying now. But I did add some aspects of that and some various interests that I have into one essay that had a theme. So I would say don't like go all over the place and talk only about culture, because a lot of people have different cultures, but you should focus on one thing that makes you specific and how being multicultural kind of aids that or helps you, because not a lot of people have those opportunities. So taking advantage of it would probably make you a strong applicant to get into university.
Good luck to you all. I look forward to seeing you in Chicago.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. I never got to thank you in person. I sent an email to Professor Birdthistle the day I got in, but I didn't really call or anything, and I feel bad about it now. But
I'll see you when you get here. So
I'm so excited.
I
I really honestly did not think I would get this opportunity, and I'm so grateful to you that you took the time out of your day, like an hour and a half, just talking to me about Chicago, and kind of instead of just I don't know, just giving me like facts or just giving your own experience. You really engaged with me and made me feel really confident and encouraged to apply. Which was kind of intimidating at first because I was like, oh my God, this person's been to like Duke and Harvard and now he's teaching at U Chicago. Like it was kind of intimidating, but you were so welcoming and you were super kind and it only made me want to go to the school more. And I don't know if you're aware, but I wrote about you in my Why U Chicago essay.
I did not know that.
You didn't know this?
My God, no, I didn't. And now I'm really relieved because that would have been mortifying if I had single-handedly sabotaged your application.
No.
You know, wow, wow, that's remarkable. You know what I should have said a second ago to your schoolmates there, and Heather, I meant to say this. This is what I did say to Hina when we talked. One thing that can obviously make the missing ingredient that would, I think, make all those essays a little bit more compelling is to say, to do the things that Hina said, which is to sort of take your idea, your vision, to cloak it in multicultural stuff, to dress it up with that. But the missing component is to say why all of that needs to come to fruition at that particular university.
Yeah.
And one thing that Hina and I talked a lot about were the particular sort of academic, remarkable people here, like Martha Nussbaum and people like that. And that is a nice, so like that's the sort of the punchline, and that's why I need to go to Chicago to, you know, so if we're being recorded, please read that part too. But anyway, that's fantastic. You know, Hina, here's a final thing I'll say about your application, which is a bittersweet story for me, but one of the most brilliant young women who is the daughter of dear friends of mine, and is just a fantastic person, was desperate to get into Chicago, and she didn't get in. And I learned about that the same day I learned about you getting in, which made me just, it made me sit in awe of how good your application must have been, Hina. So congratulations again.
Thank you. It's probably because I wrote about you in my essay.
You know, I don't think I carry much weight at this place, to be honest, but I'm glad it worked out.
I wrote about how in my Why U Chicago essay, I wrote that the U Chicago community seemed so welcoming and they were so eager to help me even when I visited. And I felt like, you know, giving specifics always helps. And I had that specific instance with you and how you were so kind and you were listening to me, just kind of vent my worries about the whole application process, because obviously this is my dream school and it holds a lot of weight for me. So yeah, you were a great example. And so I wrote about it a little bit, and I thought they would have cross-checked with you in case I was lying.
No verification.
No, okay.
You know what? They were probably so flattered. Chicago does not have, unfairly, it does not have a reputation as the world's friendliest place. So they must have been just so sort of pleased to hear that you had that experience. It is a friendly place, but it has a famous reputation. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's not how I felt, because I felt like students were really kind, but that was my experience. And so again, thank you so much. I'm so excited